A year ago, we gave the story of our laity pioneers, the choir directors of 1890. We learned of organists such as Fidelia Hamilton, and we only have a fuzzy picture to remember her by as she played the cathedral organ for 20 years. Her husband John, who was the only doctor at the much-needed St. Mark's Hospital. The missionaries to the Wild West. Those whose names are in forgotten church records. Those whose names are not only in forgotten church records, but in forgotten gold rush and silver mining towns. Last year, we learned of those now among the angels and archangels. They are our heritage, our reasons for being, all in places where one might see a cleric once a month if the stage made it through the snow.
The Episcopal Diocese of Utah, like the rest of the Episcopal Church, would be lost without the faithfulness of the laity. The laity have shown up week after week after week. Whether or not the worship has been inspiring, whether or not there's been a priest present to serve them communion, but time and time again, the laity have carried the day.
Yes, that is what we saw in last year's report. Story after story of those who faithfully occupied the pews in the first 75 years of our church in Utah. We move on now to the next chapter of remembering the laity in this, our 150th year. And so we tell the story of the second half of our life as the Diocese of Utah. Oh, we know the records of the bishops and other clerics. This is the story of the laity. There has been a new Utah in these last 75 years. It started with a modern phenomenon called suburbia. And there were old towns with new growth, especially in the St. George area of southern Utah.
Could it become a winter resort area with attractions matching those of Phoenix, for example? Well, maybe yes, maybe no, but something to think about.
But with growth, there was the reality that we had about 8 priests in the whole diocese. They were called to not only look at new ministries in a new Utah, but to still handle the old churches that had followed the mines. However, those churches were disappearing as Utah changed. The once prosperous mining towns were places that it was hard to keep a priest anyway, especially with the new ministries springing up elsewhere. Bishop Moulton wrote the worst of these dying mining towns seemed to be Park City. Even when the mines were still going, it was a tough sell. He wrote, "I have not been able to find a competent man willing to remain any length of time at Park City." He continued that the town had few living attractions, and the church was especially needed. Well, it wasn't exactly booming anymore. Of course, the toughest part of Park City now is finding which of the 78 restaurants to go to after church. But that's another story. So we left Eureka, Standardville, Castlegate, Helper, Garfield, and other places. But there would be new places for the few priests to drive their old cars to preach at least once a month. A new generation of laity was with us. In 1948, Salt Lake Episcopalian Elworth Stone started knocking on doors looking for other Episcopalians. He knocked on the Morelands door near 17th South and 20th East. He was apparently very persuasive. He noticed they had a garage, and he brought the bishop back for another visit, and All Saints was thus parked in their garage the next week. There were 77 Sunday school kids. There was a hope of maybe getting out of the garage, especially as winter approached. A Mrs. Howard said she had a basement over on 19th East, and so they hauled everything to her basement, and maybe a hope that they would actually have a church someday. The laity responded with a fashion show to raise funds, a fashion show of the very best of 1952. The church wasn't quite done, so they added a handmade doll clothes sale. Wow, those must have been quite the fashion shows, for the laity raised enough for the building. And All Saints had so many people in it that it started a new mission, St. James. Well, it was a fashion show every Sunday for St. James, as it started its life meeting in the Cottonwood Mall. They met in the ZCMI auditorium. The annual ZCMI sock sale was a special time in church, especially for the children.
There was one big sale I remember was the sock sale, and they had tables full of socks that were all set up, I think probably by size, and they managed to move those all around.
So the kids got involved with church.
Yeah, not necessarily the proper way.
Advent was a tough time at the mall.
Father Peter, on the first day of Advent, had a sermon all prepared on how this is a time of preparation. This is not celebration, this is preparation. And here is this room full of Christmas trees with all their lights going.
Meanwhile, the laity of St. Stephen's was washing away sins in a closed laundromat. If there is something to learn from the laity, then, it wasn't that they had a desire for buildings, it was that they had a desire for church, for community.
The church has always been the people and not the building. And we always run a danger when we have buildings, that the buildings become precious. And then taking care of the building becomes more important than following after Christ.
It seems each congregation was in a contest to find the most unlikely place to meet. The laity at Resurrection is certainly a finalist in that contest. They found their home in the bountiful Jeep Posse building as God's Posse.
It was interesting. There were probably 30 people that attended regularly.
And instead of iconic saints on the walls, there were buffalo heads.
They had 2 buffalo heads on each side of the altar. It was the people, it was the strength, it was their dedication and commitment that made the church stay and grow.
The former St. Barnabas met in this hotel lean-to, and All Saints finally moved out of the basement to Fort Douglas, with the kids having Sunday school in the Fort Douglas stockade. That also kept them from misbehaving. But something else was happening. For the first 75 years, the diocese went north all the way into Montana, and later west into Nevada and east into Colorado. That's because, well, there were mostly more rocks than people in the south in those old days, albeit really beautiful rocks. But we saw tourism and people coming to the south, changing all that. In Cedar City, Episcopalians just started looking for each other in the 1960s. People opened up their homes and put notices in the newspaper, "Come here for church." The Mittenswee family opened up their home, and Jim Mittenswee went one better. He got a sign inviting Episcopalians. And better yet, he got a giant pot of Cajun stew. It packed him in. It was a church, turning stew into stewardship. The laity from one place felt a calling to help another. St. Stephen's, well, it was out of the dry cleaners by now, and it wanted to help in Cedar City from 250 miles away. They took the Cedar City mission under their wing, and their priest would visit, as did their congregation, all in exchange for more Cajun food. It was a wonderful experience. They put up an altar in the front room, did communion, invited the bishop, and at that point they had a church, and thus St. Jude's was alive and active. It moved into the strip mall. The resourceful laity wanted an inexpensive liturgical cloth for Advent and Lent. They drove to Las Vegas, and they found purple satin, perfect for a Vegas club, and now perfect for St. Jude's. It grew to where it needed a bigger house of worship, and indeed it did get a house for worship. The laity fixed up the residence, and St. Jude's was home. Stacia Thomas remembers looking for an Episcopal church when she first arrived in Cedar City.
That's when I found out that the Episcopal church, there was one here in town, and I drove by it a few times and thought, okay, it's a house, and how's that going to work? there was a warmth. When you walked in that door, there was a definite warmth that you felt from the people that were there. They enveloped you. They wanted you to be part of their lives in and outside of the church.
Well, coffee hour was like a backyard barbecue.
Definitely, because of how small it was. You'd have people out in the backyard, out in the side, in the driveway, out front, inside, in the kitchen.
And then a candle ignited the house, and the house of worship burned. But in it, the congregation found what it means to be laity in a community. The people of a nearby LDS ward house stepped in and threw a joint meal to raise funds to rebuild it. It was people to people, the cornerstone of what a church should be.
I think we both realized that neither one of us were monsters, that that we were there for the common good, and that there was the one God that we were all under and working for and toward and with. I think it definitely made us feel more welcome here in Cedar City.
They are the stories of one or two Episcopalians finding each other in small southern Utah towns. One of those stories takes place in St. George.
Grace Episcopal Church has been in its home now for a couple of decades, and it is not hard to see with its tower. But we go back to the 80s and early 90s. It really was 2 or 3 gathered in His name. They decided to do a bold experiment so uncharacteristic of shy Episcopalians. They got fellow church members to call everyone in the St. George phone book. Yes, everyone. They found it their calling. One phone call volunteer was a young priest in Ogden.
With each call, I became more animated and bolder in the invitation because I felt as if I was part of something quite exciting and quite new.
I got a phone call one night from John Smith, who was one of the first members of this church. He invited me to come to Grace, which at that time was meeting in the Lions Club building. He asked me if I came, would I please bring a dozen cookies? Well, I said, well, sure, I'll bring some cookies. So then I felt like I was really committed to this. So I went to the first service.
Well, it started with cookies and moved on to playing the organ in the Lions Club sanctuary.
We had to dismantle this organ every Sunday. We had to take the pedals off. We had to push it up against the wall and cover it. Then on Sunday morning, we had to pull it out, put the pedals back on, and sometimes the pedals didn't quite jive. So you're playing a certain chord, but it's not a chord because the pedals aren't working right. So you kind of had to think, gotta play a different note there.
It was making church, one chair and one chalice at a time, and then removing it all at the end of the service. Then came the great journey. The congregation moved the altar all around town, unfolding the church at the senior center. Indeed, a church is where a few gather, and sometimes there was even a priest. The senior center was a good home, except during Halloween. It was a little hard to work these decorations into a sermon.
You go in there and here's all these ghosts flying around the ceiling and the pumpkins and the scary bats and stuff all over the church. And so that was one thing we had to deal with the Senior Citizen Center.
It is a story of grace, a story of a handful of almost forgotten people, but people who knew the Lord.
It started with those 7 original people who just felt a need to have this kind of a congregation, and it's just grown by leaps and bounds into what it is today. But certainly without the people, it would have never happened.
The rocks of southern Utah also attracted more than tourists. They brought prospectors, mules, and Episcopalians, not necessarily in that order. In 1952, things changed for Moab. The small tourist town became a booming center for the uranium industry, and over 7,000 people.
There's uranium values in that thar chunk of ore.
But some were looking for more than the glow of uranium. Many sought the light of Christ, and that light first shined in family homes where members met for services. Betty Wimmer remembers when only the laity conducted those services.
When we met in the home, we would just sit around in the living room and discuss things. There was no priest, so there was no communion.
It was years before they had their own building and a full-time priest. Their first church was at the Seventh-day Adventist Church. It was a convenient arrangement.
For a while we met in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Of course, they go on Saturday, so we were able to use it on Sunday. And it was set up just like a regular church.
They met there for several years until the momentous year of 1961 when they purchased the Cane Creek Road property. The congregation held a bazaar and a chili supper to raise funds for the new building. Food always made a better bazaar. They broke ground on Passion Sunday, March 31st, 1963. At last, the building would be completed 6 months later. Shirley Miller attended services at the original St. Francis and recalls its humble style.
It was already this church, this building, in a much more humble style. We, instead of having pews, we set up folding chairs for every service, and of course had just little kneelers. And there was no parish hall. It was just one building.
Even though they had a place to call their own and a priest, the early St. Francis needed a lot of help from the laity to keep going.
You'd have to see to the flowers if it was in the season for flowers. Just anything around the altar you had to do. Oh, and also we kept the church itself swept and cleaned and dusted and vacuumed and all that sort of thing.
Oh, there was much work to do, but it was all about serving God and raising funds for the ministry, the way they did it in the 60s, with rummage sales, treasure house carnivals, and a fall card festival.
It was just the feeling that you were helping serve God. And it made it easier for everybody that way.
Now, this is not only a story of the church spreading to more geographic areas, it is the story of the church spreading to more cultures. The southern region became not only the place of tourism, but the home to a half-dozen new Episcopal churches. It was the laity spread throughout the rocky desert that looked for each other to do the Lord's work. One church started in the shadows of Utah, just over the Arizona border. It is now an important part of our diocese, St. David's of Page. Church founders describe Page as rock, sand, and sagebrush. And that would be rock, sand, and sagebrush next to a river to be dammed. And that meant a new town to build the dam. And that meant a new church to layperson Fred Finch. He wrote the Arizona bishop letter after letter about a church. And the bishop wrote letter after letter to Fred Finch, who was 120 miles away in Kanab. And finally, the bishop said yes, so impressed that after a while, he would address the lay member as my dear fellow worker. Now the fact that the number of Episcopal families at this time are 2, well, that didn't stop Fred the fellow worker, nor did the fact they didn't have a building. They met in Dr. Kazan's waiting room in his mobile trailer office. St. David's was born, and shortly after, a $15,000 church building started taking shape on the rocks, the sand, and sagebrush. Dr. Kazan became a force in fulfilling the dream. This was pretty much all persistence and struggle. It was a struggle to finish it, so they did services outside.
Longtime member Connie Tulsovic wasn't there at that time, but imagines those days.
I can imagine the dirt because we still have a lot of dirt around this part of the country.
You know, they did not look at what was there. They looked at the potential. They had a youth group, dinners, and a square dance club. But then the dam was done and the people moved out.
I can remember driving past the church on a Sunday morning and there were no cars. So I didn't know what was going on, and I later found out from friends that they were holding services in Dr. Kazan's home because I guess the congregation at that time was relatively small.
Dr. Kazan was holding it together.
It was the laity that was doing all of the services. Occasionally we would have a visiting priest come up.
And then they woke up to the news. Dr. Kazan was killed in an airplane crash. The congregation gathered to discuss how to proceed.
We had that meeting that when they talked about, not wanting the church to close down, and if, everybody they were trying to get everybody together for that. And from the time I started attending in probably 1975, we were holding services at the church.
Later, his son was inspired to be ordained and came back as the priest. He led the small congregation to outdoor communions. And then the congregation woke up to the news that he and his wife were killed coming back from a church meeting in Phoenix.
Well, it was heartbreaking. I can remember getting a knock on the door in the middle of the night at my home, and I can't remember, some kind of police officers telling me that had happened, and I was shocked. I didn't really quite know what to do.
It is a story we need to know and learn from.
Let the doors be open.
And as a treasure for us, it transferred to our diocese. Next came this new building, dedicated in 2010.
Well, it certainly says that we have persevered. There's just something about the church that we needed to carry on, and we've done that.
When we look at stories like this, and we have them in our own Diocese of Utah, then we remember them to say, do you know that church is not just a place, it is the spirit of the people themselves.
The spirit of the people repeats throughout the history of the laity. You can find it in the congregation at San Francisco in Grand County. Their strong sense of community is what started it all. Moab became a community that turned to tourism, which brought new people, many of them from Mexico. It was among those new residents that there was a tragedy in 1999.
We had our diocesan convention for the Diocese of Utah in Moab. And just before that, a local Mexican man was killed walking on the highway. The driver was blinded by the sun coming up, and so this fellow was killed.
The offering at the final Eucharist of convention was collected for the man's family. Those at the convention were moved at the opportunity to help. One was John McQueen.
We then found out that we were the only church that did anything like that.
That inspired the victim's family to reach out to the laity of St. Francis.
A woman who was a cousin of this guy came in and asked us if we would be interested, Father Jim and myself, in going to a dedication of a cross where the guy was killed. And they stayed for the service that day.
That woman was Leticia Bentley. She remembers exactly how she felt.
And I remember just praying so much that day because I didn't know if I was going to make it. I felt so depressed.
John had a book of common prayer in Spanish from his many years living in South America. He and Father Jim Tendick worked to quickly put together a service to comfort the family.
God sent you angels when you need them.
And so the Spanish-speaking members of the community found the need for a church, and San Francisco was born. The first service was in early 2000. Many of them worked in the tourism industry, making Sunday services impossible. So they decided on Tuesday night as the best time to get together. The response was great.
We were blown away. It went very well. And as I said, we did this with not knowing at all what was going to happen, whether 2 people were going to show up, or 10 people, or 100 people, or anywhere in between. And the response was very good.
18 years later, San Francisco is still thriving. It is a place for the Spanish-speaking people to find God and keep tradition. The Spanish-speaking laity didn't just find tradition in new churches. In fact, it started in the oldest church in our diocese in Salt Lake City. The Reverend Isabel Gonzalez was a lay member when she attended the early Spanish language services at St. Mark's.
When we moved to Utah from California, the service already was in the cathedral. And then I started getting involved in a few activities to raise money, to help in the altar guild, to help the people.
The language barrier meant translating every word of the service. The laity asked and prayed for a Spanish-speaking priest.
It's not easy to communicate with a priest that doesn't speak or doesn't understand really the culture, the Mexican or the Latino culture.
And so they found Father Pablo Ramos, and their ministry took off.
In 1998, Father Pablo came from Mexico, and then is when really started the real service in Spanish.
The Spanish-speaking laity saw the need for a place in their community. They found a home within West Valley City.
Father Pablo and the time Leticia was a priest here, so they had to get an agreement, how we want to move from the cathedral to San Esteban's.
Isabel and the pioneers from the cathedral expanded their ministry to a new generation in their West Valley City home.
We have more people since we moved here. We have now more like 190. Not every Sunday, but most of the members are here. In the cathedral, maybe we have like 40, like 60, but no more than that.
Seeing her community grow and become stronger inspired the lay worker Isabel to achieve a long-term goal.
For me, the service here means a lot to me. I think my dream came true because when I was a child, my dream was to be a priest. And when I was ordained, my dream came true.
The need to serve Spanish-speaking laity continues to grow. Now the Reverend Pablo Ramos and the Reverend Isabel Gonzalez and others help with the Spanish-speaking services in Ogden.
I have people who help me in Ogden to set up and everything.
Yes, people who come together in the name of God. This is one of the Easter services at All Saints in Salt Lake City. We are all Easter people as Episcopalians. There is no congregation that defines that more than this congregation of the Sudanese who found each other in a land so far away.
Christ has been raised from the dead.
They were the lost boys and girls of the South Sudan. They were orphans who saw murder and genocide and starvation. They walked by day and hid by night and spent months and years walking thousands of miles on the desert. Gabriel Atem had a Bible with him as a lost boy. Each night the Bible became his hope that he would wake up alive on the desert.
I know one day, one time, I will be able to celebrate the Easter with all of my joys, happiness, and all the so that I know God is suffering and died for me and raised for me.
Out of the laity, Gabriel became a leader.
When we came to this country, yes, we don't even know that I will be in Utah. I will be in Salt Lake. But God has a purpose. He was giving me this chance to be in the United States. He was giving me this chance to be in Salt Lake City.
Yes, an Easter people, a group of laity who come together because of Jesus.
It takes away all of my struggle, my difficulties life that I have been went through.
But that was the past. This is the future. This is the new Easter for the laity.
I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Gabriel saw his twins become the first generation that would be born in peace.
Amen.
They would run no more. They were home. And out of the laity finding each other, and in a distant place, the community grew, the church grew, for the church is always the people. And in something not even Gabriel could have imagined, he would be ordained after years of study, risen out of the desert and out of the laity, the Reverend Gabriel Atem. And in a God-given gift to us all, he would be ordained again to the sacred order of priests. It still is a church of pioneers finding each other, finding a need and finding the Lord, a church that captures the spirit of others.
What we see in these people is that God is not a concept. God is right there with them all of the time. And when they speak about God, they speak about God in such a close and personal way that there's never any doubt that when they are saying God or Jesus, that they are talking about a living reality that has permeated their lives, that a reality that has saved them and gave them safe haven, while so many of their numbers perished. So God for them is always as close as the breath they have just taken.
We have seen the spirit and the beauty of the laity. Time and time again, they come together with devotion to do the Lord's work as their first priority, and the thought of what building to meet in as their last priority. And yes, there is one place where that all still happens in our diocese. Every Sunday, the people of Spirit of the Desert set up the chairs. It's normally a yoga studio, but for a few hours, it will be the Episcopal Church in Ivans, near St. George.
We don't even think about the fact that we're in a yoga room. It feels like a church.
The altar comes out of a back room, and more chairs, and of course the Episcopal flag. The hymnals come out of the book closet. The hymns have already been selected.
I picked hymns that I liked.
It takes about 20 minutes to make a church, although they realize it took 2,000 years to make the content.
It becomes a church when we begin the worship service.
Almighty God, to you all hearts are open, all desires known.
Yes, the yoga studio is now a church, with God's grace and in the middle of God's beauty.
Onward, Christian soldiers.
It's not like church in an old building, or with a choir, or with an organ, and they don't miss that, because this is church.
We didn't really decide that. That was decided for us. We didn't have an organ. We didn't have the money to have an organ. We didn't have an organist.
And like other new churches, it has been on a journey. It actually started in the former priest's front room.
I remember that first night. There were people everywhere. We had people up and down the aisle, over in this room, because my house wasn't that big. But it all faced out to the Red Cliffs, which helped.
Yes, new territory for the church that started 150 years ago. With new people looking for each other to look for the Jesus movement together. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them. And we are a better church and a better people because of it.